everyone. Here is another episode of the DigitalituM podcast at the intersection of manufacturing and digital transformation. My today's guest is Ed Marsh. I had the pleasure already to be on his podcast. Now I'm returning the favor and ask him to join me. Our topic today is also at the intersection of manufacturing and digital transformation, but focusing more on the sales part in B2B. Welcome, Ed.
Well, thank you for having me, Marcus. I always enjoy our conversations.
That's great. So let's get started. Tell a little bit about yourself.
Well, I could talk for a long time and most of it would be irrelevant. I think perhaps what's most relevant to your audience is the fact that I have been partners with a German Mittelstand Maschinenbau since 2000. And that partnership has taken a number of twists and turns, but it was essentially a partnership in the U.S. subsidiary, the daughter company of a German manufacturer of capital equipment that was sold primarily to the packaging and printing industry. In 2008, 2009, that business was severely challenged with I guess they call it the GFC here, the Great Financial Crisis. And also by the fact when the euro went to $1.65, I mean, the business model was really untenable at that point. So that's not my primary focus now. For about the last 10 years, I've spent my time consulting for U.S., well, I should say middle market industrial manufacturers, mostly capital equipment companies. A number of my clients have been the U.S. subsidiaries of German companies because I understand a lot of the cultural challenges and differences there. But I'm really focused on revenue growth. So where a lot of these companies spend a lot of time thinking about their engineering and production and operations, I find that often there's a sharp contrast between the rigor that they bring to the back end of the business and the very casual attitude they bring to the front end of the business. They just kind of think that somehow marketing and sales are going to happen. But they do all the hard work at the back end. We got to do the same hard work on the front end. That's what I spend time working with companies on.
Yeah, and that's where we jump right into this, I say, cultural difference between doing business in Europe and the whole approach of selling capital equipment versus the way how it's done here. And to just sum it up, it's not the same. What are the differences in your point of view? Just on a rough note, we dive deeper later into specific things.
Yeah, sure. So let me say, by way of context, I've done a lot of business in India. I started and ran a company in India, done a lot of business in Brazil and in Nigeria and in a variety of markets in addition to Germany. I'm also married to a German national. And so I've got some kind of insight into some of the differences that way as well. I think at a very high level, German companies tend to plan much further ahead in a much more structured way. So if a German company is thinking about buying a piece of machinery, they're thinking 3 years out. They say, okay, this is the expansion we want to do. This is why we want to do it. This is what the goal is of it. Here's the elements that are going to be necessary to do that, including this capital equipment. Given all this context, we know it has to be able to do these things. And so we can begin a very deliberate and careful engineering-based capability survey to find the right solution to make that decision. So that leads to a certain set of buying behaviors and a certain set of market expectations and a certain expectation for what salespeople are going to do on the vendor side. In contrast, American companies tend to move much faster and in what to the German perspective probably looks like a very chaotic sort of way. To the American perspective, it's entrepreneurial and it's taking advantage of opportunity. So a lot depends on which side you sit on, how you see it. But, I believe the bigger opportunity in U.S. business is not to respond to companies' inquiries, but rather to go in and be a strong consultative salesperson and create projects by helping them understand ways that they can improve that they might not have thought of. So if you're selling to the German Geschäftsführer, that might be unwelcome. They might say, hey, leave us alone. We've got to figure it out. We know our business. In the U.S., if you're a good salesperson, that can actually differentiate you and help you win a lot of business.
Yeah, I agree. By understanding what is their problem and then bring the specific solution, which makes them overall faster, more efficient.
Yeah, make more,
save
spend
money,
less. Those
ROI, all this topics.
Right.
A while ago, I made a post on LinkedIn comparing that behavior also on that topic, selling features versus value. You may remember that post where I showed a fork and then kind of highlighted how a German engineer would sell that fork with how precise the tips are and how precise the surface structure
That
is.
post is how we met originally.
Yeah, exactly. And then on the American side, of course, overdid it and said, with this fork, you can eat 20% faster, which is the value what this with product, which that product brings. Do you agree on that? Is that really the difference, or is?
Yeah, so I think that's part of the difference, but I think it needs to go further. So this realization happened for me probably in about 2004, maybe, when we were working on marketing for these German manufactured products in the US. And we had one type of machine that was, at the time it was maybe 20 to 30,000 USD. And we could sell it into a variety of different markets. So one typical application was pharmaceuticals, where we'd be talking to a 25 or 30-year-old pharmaceutical engineer recently out of engineering school with an FDA book this thick with all the things they needed to think about and validate and that kind of thing. But the identical machine was often sold to, kind of, if we talked about it in terms of a buyer persona, it could be a lady who was 50 or 60 years old, who was divorced, who had started a greeting card company just because that was her passion, taking pictures or illustrations or whatever, and had been so successful. She was now selling so many greeting cards that she couldn't count them and pack them in bags of 5 fast enough while she was watching TV at night. And so she had to buy a machine to help her do that. Identical machine, two completely different applications, two completely different conversations and applications. And the German A4 brochure had the same information for both, the number of millimeters per minute and the type of rubber and all these different things. And it was clear to me that we had to speak in very different ways. If you back up, even in American sales, the shortcoming is that often people are taught to look for pain. They look for pain that they know they can solve, and they say, okay, that's your problem. I can help you solve it. But that completely skips the important piece. The value is interesting, but the business outcome is what drives the decision. So if you can go faster, that's great, but nobody buys because they can go faster. Going faster means you work one less shift, or you take on another contract without increasing your fixed costs, or you're able to, to gain orders that you can't gain because you got a faster lead time. Those are examples of the kinds of business outcomes. And if we can't think in terms of business outcomes and translate what our machine or what our solution does, not only to solve the pain and not only to create value, but to actually push those dots close enough together for buyers to understand how we're changing their business, then we're going to struggle. So I think that becomes, and I would argue that regardless of how people are accustomed to buying in whatever market in the world, that fundamentally is what we need to do to sell across cultures. Now, the language and the tempo and the steps we take may be a little bit different, but that fundamentally is how people around the world make business decisions.
Yeah, I agree on that. That's on one side, there are many, many different cultures around the world and in all the different markets, but that value proposition thinking is what every culture understands. The priorities might be different in different cultures, but that thinking is definitely understandable. I agree on that.
And you have to account for other aspects of culture. So it's not only a very traditional and linear and orderly and specs-based mindset in Germany, but if you're selling in Germany, you also have to think about the impact on, I forget your term for it, but the company committee that includes employees and representatives of the union and the board. Mm-hmm. We don't typically have an analog to that in the US. And so we think about selling to the CEO and the CFO and the plant manager and the plant engineer and the controls engineer and those kinds of people. And we don't ever stop to think about what would be involved in trying to get a decision pushed through a body like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you sell into the German market, then you have to consider maybe these things as this people or these groups are involved into a buying decision, which you as an outsider may don't know.
All right, exactly.
The other topic in capital equipment is always the service part of things, which has its challenges when you do international business. From a German point of view, at least in the past, customer service wasn't that of a focus. We still have that term Servicewüste Deutschland, Service Desert Germany, versus here in B2C or B2B, customer service is played on a on a Champions League level, the best of the best. And that has its challenges as well.
Yeah, so I can't speak to B2C. Aside from my experiences, some good, some frustrating as a consumer, my professional emphasis is on B2B. Now, I can tell you that I see another set of problems that often arise, and that's when companies feel like they need to ship machines because they've promised a lead time or they've got a reporting deadline coming up and they want to recognize revenue. And somebody somewhere makes an explicit decision to ship a machine they know is not ready. And sometimes they tell the service people and sometimes they don't, but invariably that puts the service people in a very difficult position. So
I've been there.
And that is horrible when that happens. So I think that at a high level, being honest, honoring your commitments, figuring out how to get it done on time, but being honest with everybody is critically important. Somebody told me once you can always hide behind the truth, and I think that's a great expression, rather than throw a service technician into a situation that they can't win, and the company never really recovers from that. The reputation is always damaged. I think that the question of service is an important one, but I mean, you're an expert, obviously, in helping companies figure out how to deliver better remote service. And it's important because service technicians burn out. If you're asking somebody to travel all the time on short notice, over weekends, being gone all the time, they're not really as fresh and sharp when they show up on site. And they try to have a good attitude and they work hard, but they're burned out. So if we can deliver faster service, the best service, solves the problem quickly. And so if we can solve the problem by a remote diagnostic call in a matter of 15 minutes, then not only does it save thousands of dollars to send a technician overseas, but often there's weeks long of wait and there's downtime in the meantime. So, I think that you're on the right track with all the work that you're doing around solving the service problems.
Yeah, and overall, my point of view here is that with all the tools and technologies you have under the umbrella of digitalization, that you actually can do much more and that you can change even the business model from an reactive service, which I always compare like the firefighters. They are waiting in their firehouse until the alarm rings and then they go out, versus a proactive approach where they have smoke detectors in buildings, which then alarm when something is starting already, to have the time to fix this problem before it gets the kajinka boom super fire.
Or let's back up even further and using that analogy, let's say a reminder to change the batteries in the smoke detector every 6 months or once a year, so that we're proactively, not only we're getting early warning, but we're proactively preventing problems.
Which goes in this whole topic of predictive maintenance, by preventing a part to get bad by changing it before, but figuring out when is that right moment. Because a lot of times you say you have to replace this part, let's say every half a year, or replace that battery every half a year, but maybe under the actual conditions it lasts a year. So it's actually a waste to do that every half year and put the time and the money into it.
But let's look at it from another angle. One of the things that I argue frequently is that customer service people and aftermarket parts people should be salespeople, and they don't like that. They don't want to think of themselves as salespeople. There's negative associations with it. Companies want to, hesitate about that. And I say, look, we're never going to try to sell something to some company that we don't think they need. On the other hand, if somebody calls up and says, hey, I've got this problem, I need to replace this bearing, help me figure out the part number and get me a quote on it, and how quick can you get it to me when my machine's down? I think that the aftermarket person ought to say, all right, absolutely, let's figure that out. But experience tells me if you get the machine apart to do that, you probably ought to look at the bearing on the other end, and maybe the shaft, and maybe the chain, and maybe the sprocket that connect to that, because you're going to have to replace those soon. And you're going to save all the time of taking it apart if you just put them in at the same time. So I think that's better customer service. That's also selling. It grows the aftermarket revenue and it delivers a better experience for the buyer. So I think that's something that companies don't think about that they ought to.
I agree, and I still consider the OEM of a machine the subject matter expert for the equipment they build, and the expertise of what needs to be all done throughout the life cycle of that machine in order to keep it running at an optimal production and optimal OEE, operational equipment efficiency. Because that is what counts for the user of that capital equipment. They want to run their equipment as efficient as possible with 100% OEE. That's their dream.
But I will tell you, I've done some fairly extensive buyer research with American buyers of equipment. And as much as German companies and even American companies want to say, but we've got the best durability and the longest life cycle and the lowest total cost of ownership and highest OE and that kind of thing, the way that decisions get made up front, it just assumes that that's the case, and nobody really considers that. They'll say, "Oh yeah, that's important, thank you." But if they build a matrix of what the criteria are for how they're deciding, that's not one of the criteria, and so that's another disconnect between the way the German market thinks of it and the way the American market buys.
What are then, in your point of view, the criteria which are on that matrix, just in general terms?
All right, so this comes down to salesmanship. It also comes down to the way companies are buying right now. So if you wait until a company calls you up and says, "Hey, we're thinking about buying this," then their criteria, only 16% of the time will they change their criteria through conversations with sales reps. So basically, they've decided on their own, doing research, 67% of the way through their buying journey before they're willing to talk to a sales rep, and it's all locked in. If, on the other hand, salespeople can get to them early and create the project and educate them on the way they ought to think about it, then you can help to set the criteria and incorporate things that might not necessarily be part of the way they're looking at it. So
that's a good point.
If you wait until they've locked their criteria in, then they're typically talking about technical details, which makes it comfortable for the salespeople because that's what the salespeople like to talk about. But there's nothing in that discussion that actually goes to the question of who's going to request the capital, what's the justification for capital, how's this project going to be weighed against others, stack ranked against other places to spend the money, who's going to make the decision on capital appropriation, what projects are competing for this that might win against it. So all of this important stuff about the decision of whether or not the project happens is opaque to most salespeople, and instead they just focus on the technical details, which is what they're comfortable talking about. But that means then they put this deal in their forecast because they've had a great conversation about technical details. Everyone says, "Oh yeah, this meets our requirement, looks good. We should know by the end of Q3," without any idea about whether this project is actually ever going to happen or why it's going to happen.
By not fully understanding the customer side and what are their actual criteria.
And what's the motivation for it? And why does, what animates this timeline? Is it just something that somebody arbitrarily said, "I'd like to cross it off my list by the end of Q3"? Or is it some customer driven or regulatory driven or investor driven sort of an initiative with a date where there's a consequence if it doesn't happen by then? If you're not clear on that, then the deals that you're putting into your forecast are just, it's a mirage.
Yeah, I fully agree on that, and I have experiences in that as well. These are some good points. What do you think have changed in the last couple of years in the whole sales and marketing game in terms of the uprise of all the digital possibilities from social media into video and AI?
All right, so let me answer that a couple different ways. Number one, if you've got, let's say, a 6, 12, 18-month sales cycle, like many of your listeners have, and we recognize that buyers are, according to most recent statistics, 67% of the way through their buying journey before they want to talk to a rep, and the buying team is typically around 9 people, and 70% of the time, the companies that go onto the short list were known to them before they ever began a project, and 70% of the time, the number one company on the short list ultimately gets the order. Then that helps to understand. And 75% of buyers wish that they never had to talk to a salesperson, and more than half of buyers are willing to do e-commerce transactions of over 6 figures now. So that helps you understand from the sales side of things. On the marketing side of things, that means that marketing has to do sales for 67% of the buying journey. Sales has to be able to be much more proactive and get into accounts and not wait for inbound leads. But I think the statistic that's most alarming, if you will, is that over the course of the last 18 months, we've watched let me think of the right way to say it. So if you do a Google search, the results show you some sort of a Google generated answer up top, a couple paid listings, and then the organic listings. The organic listings are those where Google thinks this is a good answer to your question, and it takes you to somebody's web page. We've gone from nearly 100% of searches clicking on an organic search link to only 28% of searches clicking on an organic search link. And at the same time,
And where do the others go?
Well, so the others, either they just get the answer from the digest at the top of the page, or they do
Or the
another
paid
search.
ones?
Or not the paid ones are about 0.4%, or they do another search. So that means two things are happening. First of all, Google's losing search volume to people who use Perplexity and other tools. And for the remaining Google search volume, the likelihood that your content marketing is going to get you found has fallen by definition by 75%. And at that point, even if you do get found, if you're not one of the people that was known to them before they created their shortlist, your likelihood of winning the order is very, very, very low. So all of that means now that our emphasis needs to be not on talking about projects, not on responding to inquiries, not on prospecting to find out who's got an active project. Rather, our activity across marketing and sales has to be about building trust, building familiarity, and helping companies create projects. So completely different skill sets and a very different way of looking at marketing and sales. And that means that we need different skills in those departments. We need different staffing. We need different allocation of resources. So I think that the changes are accelerating. And for traditional machinery manufacturing companies, particularly those with the additional tradition and conservative approach of kind of German culture, these are changes that are easy to ignore and critically important to not ignore.
It was a long answer, but a good one. So just to sum it up, you're saying if you're a manufacturer and you put, let's say, a lot of technical information on your website, and that's it, what you do with the hope that Google then finds that website and does that link. With the recent developments, there's less incoming traffic. So you have to be, in controversy, you have to be active and promote and do the outreach into your buyer persona and go that way.
Absolutely. And you have to think about how you're going to market so that LLMs find you. And so just putting the technical details there don't help an LLM. Doing comparisons.
With LLM, you mean the AI side of things.
Right. Because a lot of people are turning, with deep research, you can go now and say, hey, I want to buy an XYZ machine, build a plan for how I ought to go about researching it, what options I ought to consider, what alternatives, how I look at the financial implications, do this whole thing for me, and it'll spit out a plan. And so we need to be creating marketing in a way that we can be successful with the LLMs. And the best way to do that is to connect the dots for the LLM. If we just have static details about us, it doesn't help. We need to provide context and comparison so that the LLM picks it up and incorporates it. Further, I think the other piece that we need to absolutely understand is that we can't do it ourselves. We have to start to leverage partnerships. We have to recognize who the adjacent experts and technologies are that are working with the same kind of buyers that we have, because we need to create relationships with them that we can leverage for mutual reach and introductions. If you cold call a CEO and say, hey, have you thought about a new laser cutting machine? Come on, don't waste my time. I got so much other stuff on my plate. On the other hand, if you're selling laser cutters and you've got a great relationship with, maybe robotic systems that do polishing or metal suppliers or, whatever the case may be, that are selling into the same market, and you build relationships and you start to approach each other's market and sharing helpful information, you've got an opportunity to get into accounts with a degree of credibility that you didn't have otherwise. We need to break out of this idea, which is really common in industrial manufacturing, that this is my little area. This is what I know really well. Outside of that, I'm not an expert. I shouldn't talk about it. Well, I disagree. Yes, you're not an expert. No, you shouldn't portray yourself as an expert. But what you can absolutely do is build a faculty, a collection of people who have expertise in these other areas, who are willing to help you meet the marketplace with that expertise, whether it's on your podcast or in articles that you do together or in panel sort of LinkedIn Live events that you have, or whatever the case may be. You need to be able to talk about a broad range of business topics that are of critical interest to your buyers. Only 3% of the potential buyers for any given product or service are in the market for it at any given time. So that means if you need to build trust ahead of time so that when a company puts a short list together, you end up on the short list, then you need to be talking about things that are part of the 97% of the stuff they're thinking about the rest of the time. And because that's not what you do every day, you need to build this faculty of partners and experts who help you talk about those topics so that you become a trusted resource.
Yeah, I fully agree on that. And that's also typical here more in the American market. It's the whole model of a distributor who offers a wide range of different products into a specific industry niche.
Yeah, but it's going beyond just distributors and resellers. I mean, it's going now to like if you take yourself, for instance, I mean, you're a distributor or reseller or a solutions provider for a variety of different technical solutions. But at the same time, if I wanted somebody that understood these third-party service companies, you'd be a great resource for that as well because of everything that you do. So whether you've got an actual personal involvement in third-party service, which I think you're developing actually as another line of work, but even put that aside, because of the stuff that you do so well, you'd be a great resource to talk about the pros and cons of third-party service. So even if you weren't selling that, that would be an area that you would share kind of a nexus with a machine company on to be able to talk about why that's important.
Yeah, these are good points. And also from a business standpoint, there's always that option then of what we call cross-selling.
Exactly.
A request comes in, it might be not a perfect fit for you or what you offer, but as you have other people or companies in your network, you refer that to them. And then on the other way, something also comes back. So it's business wise a give and take.
But again, let's go further than that. Let's say you're a company that sells machines and you know that the biggest problem that your buyers have is finding talented, skilled labor, even if it's not to run your machine elsewhere in their facility. Then why not have somebody on your faculty that runs a technical, skilled labor recruiting company and have them talk to you? Maybe you write articles together, maybe they're on a podcast episode, maybe you create a video series, maybe you do a LinkedIn Live talking about what most manufacturers don't understand about hiring skilled labor. So it may not help you directly sell another machine in the short term, but it's going to help you build a relationship with somebody who could potentially buy your machine in the future, and they're going to then think of you as a trusted resource.
Yeah, and that's this out of the box thinking, out of your specific industry niche in bigger terms in how business can be accelerated.
And we got to step beyond thinking about people buy because of meters per minute or, newtons per square meter or all these other factors.
This technical engineering, facts, precision, and all of that. Very good points. Next topic in this whole game is trade shows. During the COVID times when we were not allowed to get out and meet for people, there was this kind of sentiment that this is now also the end of trade shows. We don't need that anymore. Everything from now on goes digital. And then when everything relaxed, at least what I saw here in the American side, the trade show kind of boomed up again, and it's like in the olden days. Do you think the trade shows, this traditional concept, still has a future? And from a B2B vending point of view, should you invest in a booth and present yourself there?
So there's a couple different questions there. I think that shows, or let's speak more broadly, in-person events, I think absolutely they have a future. Now, what should your booth look like? How big should it be? I think you should experiment. And maybe you go to one show and try a 10 by 10 booth and a hospitality suite. And maybe, in your booth, you don't have a machine. Alternatively, maybe you've got a 40 by 40 booth with a couple machines in there and lots of motion and activity, and you start to see what works. But you need to define very carefully what your goal for the trade show is. Is it to generate new leads? Is it to have meetings with existing projects? Is it to foster relationships with longtime customers hoping to stay in touch with them? Is it to research competitors? Is it to try to recruit and hire new employees? You could have lots of different objectives, but you need to be very clear and you need to have a plan for how you're going to achieve them. What I see happens most often is companies do whatever they've done before. They spend a ton of money, they show up, and then they hope that everything goes well, but they're not quite sure what goes well means, aside from some let's generate this many leads number. And then further, what I often see, and I don't have formal data on this, I can tell you anecdotally, my experience is not more than 30% of trade show leads ever got followed up on. And most of those that do, quote unquote, get followed up on maybe get one email or one voicemail. And, I think this will be controversial, but I believe the companies ought to charge their salespeople for leads. I mean, you know what it costs you to do a show. You know how many leads you got out of it. So let's say you spent, $250,000 and you got 100 leads out of it. You know what each lead is worth. Charge your salespeople, build some kind of a credit and debit, set a specific expectation for what you expect follow-up to be, 12 omni-channel outreaches across phone, voicemail, sales video, email, direct mail, social
Social
media.
media, full
Exactly.
9 yards.
And once they have documented in the CRM that they've done that, then fine, they get credit for it. Or once they get a meeting, they get credit for it. But if they get assigned a lead and never do anything about it, the company spent a ton of money working on that, and I wouldn't tolerate it. So I think you have to plan well ahead of time. You have to be clear what the objectives are when you're there, and then you have to have a plan for ruthless execution on the back end of it. And most companies, I think, fail, unfortunately, on all three of those.
Yes, and I see that as well. Also, as a guest, when you walk the show and you go on booth and you get this traditional email a few days after the conference, thank you for attending the show, and blah blah blah, and here's our brochure, and that's it. There are only a few ones who then come back or go through different channels, what you call the omni-channel approach, to really figure out what's going on and what's the interest for that particular product or service.
But this also comes back to the fact that companies have this idea that the only qualified lead is one where somebody's got an active project. And if you realize that only 16% of the times can you change the spec, and 70% of the time the company is already number one on the short list wins the order, then that's not a very successful way to grow business. What you ought to be there is with a plan for how you can meet people and create relationships so that in the future, when a project comes up, you're trusted and familiar.
Yeah, which comes in regular information, newsletter, LinkedIn, and so on. Even as there are also downsides, as when you do newsletter, 80 or 90% go straight into any type of spam folder and are never read.
But also, when you do a newsletter, don't talk about you. Oh, we built a new office, or we have this new hire, or we recently released this new tweak, or HMI has different menu points or that kind of crap. Nobody cares. Nobody cares about what you make. They care about the business outcome. So if you're going to do a newsletter, I'd say you have to put it in the context of how, success stories, or how you're helping companies achieve business outcomes, or what kinds of outcomes they could think about that they might never have thought of before.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. It's not just general blah, blah. It's helping your clients to solve a problem or get them insights in how things can be solved, so that they think, actually, I'm having a similar issue and I haven't even thought that these guys can help me with that.
Bingo.
So let me research further into that, check out their website, read about it. And then when they have the confirmation there, then schedule a call or send them an email and get in direct communication.
Right.
Going a little broader, as a lot of small, medium manufacturers and industrial component manufacturers still want to get into the large American market, what are some tips and guidelines for you, what they should keep in mind?
So oftentimes what I find is they hire somebody with industry experience. Mm-hmm. The way a German company typically finds their first U.S. employee is somebody who has worked somewhere in the industry. And They may set up a small office and they're not clear what the objective is. And that person is often, honestly, not a very good salesperson. That person typically has gone from one company to another every 3 years. Your 12-month sales cycle, 12 months, some ramp up time, sales cycle time, realize they're not performing, and then they're going from company to company. They speak the language in terms of the technical details. So if that's what you believe a salesperson needs to have, they seem good, but they never deliver orders. You need to be clear. Are you selling through channel? Are you selling directly? You need to be clear who your ideal customer profile is. So I think the most important thing is to hire an absolutely superb salesperson. And that superb salesperson will be able to address the issues of support and all that kind of stuff. And you'll think of it as 2 to 3 years of collecting market research and understanding, and a very gradual and painful process of getting one installation and then another installation. And then you begin to think about opening an office and some local support and growing the sales organization. What I've also seen happen frequently is they hire somebody, they're very excited, they're disappointed with the results. They decide Americans, they don't get it. They're dumb. So we're going to take somebody from the German company and send them over, somebody who knows the U.S. because they spent 6 months in school here and they've been to New York and Orlando and Los Angeles. And they know the U.S. and they know Germany. They're going to be successful. They struggle because they don't really understand the U.S. market. And then the company says,
And the U.S. culture.
Exactly. It was a mistake. The Americans aren't ready for our high quality machines and they just withdraw. So if you've seen that cycle time and time again, instead of following it, let's disrupt it and let's take a different approach. And I believe the key is to have a superstar salesperson, ideally somebody who's got some cultural familiarity. So the natural frustrations that are going to exist between the German and the Americans can at least be dealt with. And that means using a process and a methodology for hiring a superstar salesperson, which is not intuitive, particularly for a very traditional sort of German sales organization. I think that's the most key thing.
And how do you define that or figure out if somebody is that super salesperson? Do you check it through, for example, special personality tests?
So personality tests, that's an interesting question. Personality and behavioral tests are only 20 and 22% predictive of sales success, respectively. Resumes are only 18% predictive. Traditional interviews are only 18% predictive. So I think there's a couple different pieces to it. Number one, you have to attract the right people. And so that means having a wonderful job posting, not a job description, but a job posting. It doesn't talk about the dry details of the job. It talks about the person who's going to be a superstar. Number two, using a sales specific, predictively accurate assessment tool so that you know up front not only who can sell, but who will sell in the context of the very specific conditions in your market, the price point, the level they need to sell to, the length of the sales cycle, degree of competition, et cetera. And then a very carefully engineered and structured process for interviewing people to take them through it. So I think all three of those are important components along the way. And then you got to have good onboarding. You have to have good training. You have to have good sales management. You have to have all those pieces. But the process of recruiting and hiring should be every bit as carefully engineered as the process by which you work from the bill of materials and put a machine together.
Oh, that's a good answer. Thank you for that. We're coming already to the end of our time. Thank you so much, Ed, for sharing all your insights to that specific matter. I'm pretty sure my listeners and my network are appreciated in all the information you shared. Your contact details will be down in the show notes. You're also happy to share, follow, like, and comment this podcast. Also hop on to Ed's podcast. He brings out new episodes on regular basis as well.
Well, thank you for having me, Marcus. It's like I said at the beginning, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. I like the give and take. I like the cultural kind of flexibility that you bring and our ability to talk about some of these topics that can be very frustrating, but are also really interesting to understand.
Exactly. All right. Have a good one and thank you.